Unleash the dogs of war because the armigers are here. You really don't want a pack of these jumping on any of your tanks anytime soon. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where we're here for another Imperial Knights strategy video. As part of Knight Fortnight, we'll be doing 2 weeks worth of Knights videos and carrying on with our regular Space Marine content as well. Today it's time to have a look at the Armiger Warglaives. In this video we'll take a look at the datasheet, how to include one in your army, any ways that we can buff them up with extra relics or stratagems, and my advice for how I'd field them on the tabletop. Now, these armigers were very well received when they first came out. I personally really like the look of these mini knights. They remind me a lot of miniature Warhound Titans, which might well have been the look that Games Workshop were going for. In the background, armigers are frequently bondsmen to the larger knights, as they have a diminished command and control device known as a Helm Mechanicum that is usually subordinate to one of the Throne Mechanicums of the larger Questoris or Dominus pattern knights. For this reason, they're usually not regarded in anywhere near as high esteem as the bigger knights, and the duty is often given to disgraced nobles or minor relatives of the household. They're well known for working in packs to compensate for their knight's smaller size, and they're absolutely devastating close quarters with a massive melta cannon and their signature Reaper chain cleaver. So let's see what they can do for us on the tabletop. So despite being a bit smaller than their Questoris and Dominus counterparts, the armigers still have a very beefy stat line. They're a Lord of War choice for an Imperial Knights army, and you can take 1 to 3 of them for each Lord of War choice of armigers you take. So for example, if you were to fill out a super heavy detachment with armigers, you could have anywhere between 3 and 9 armigers in that detachment, so you can really field as many of these as you really want. At base, they cost 162 points each when armed with a heavy stubber. They have a movement of 14, so can really get where they need to go very, very quickly indeed. Weapon skill 3, ballistic skill 3, strength 6, toughness 7, 12 wounds, 4 attacks, leadership 8 and a 3-up save. They are bracketed when they're down to less than half wounds, where they will have a movement of 10 and weapon skill and ballistic skill will drop to 4 up, and then if they've got 3 wounds or less remaining, they'll drop to 7-inch movement and weapon skill and ballistic skill of 5 up. So they still are moving pretty quickly even when they're on their very lowest bracket, which is nice. Each Armiger Warglaive is armed with a heavy stubber, thermal spear and a Reaper chain cleaver, and their only option is to trade out that heavy stubber for a melta gun, which will cost you an additional 12 points, so your armiger will then cost 174 points in total. The thermal spear is the armiger's primary ranged weapon. It's essentially a big melta gun. Its range is 30 inches, its assault D3, so suffers no penalty for moving and firing, strength 8, AP -4 and D6 damage, and if you're within half range when you fire the weapon at your target, then you can roll the 2 dice and discard the lowest as per the normal melta rules. So this isn't too bad a little weapon. It's quite good against low toughness vehicles with no invul save, say such as a Space Marine Rhino or similar. On average against that target it will do about 3 wounds damage to it if it's not within half range. It's considerably less use against heavier targets with invul saves though. Say if it's actually firing against another Imperial Knight, say a Knight Gallant, then it will only do 1.5 wounds on average, so it's not quite as strong against them. So its shooting isn't awful, but it doesn't really compare to other ranged units of its points cost, so a lot of its value comes from its melee profile. That Reaper chain cleaver has 2 different damage attack modes. It can either use strike, which is melee times 2 strength, -3 AP and 3 damage. So this is pretty much like your standard Dreadnought close combat weapon. It'll be hitting on strength 12. So overall it'll have a far better impact if you manage to get it into melee rather than if it has to be shooting all the game, against hard targets at any rate. Its other profile is sweep. This is strength user, so strength 6, AP -2 and 1 damage, but you get to double the amount of attacks that you make with this weapon, so it will generally be having 8 attacks, so should be good for killing about 4 or 5 guardsman equivalents per turn. As we mentioned before, its only option is to replace its heavy stubber with a melta gun. I generally prefer to save the points and put the points saved towards more knights myself, but as the armiger is going to be getting up close and personal, I can see the justification in throwing an extra melta shot on the platform to hopefully really mess up enemy tanks just that little bit more. The armiger has a few special rules. It's got an ion shield, the same as all knights, so it has a 5+ invulnerable save against ranged weapons. It can explode, so when it's destroyed, if you roll a 6, then every unit within 6 inches of it takes d3 mortal wounds. And it has the vehicle squadron special rule, which means that if you buy 3 of them as one Lord of War choice, then you essentially set them up all within 6 inches of each other, and from then on they're treated as separate units. They can just go and do their own thing, which is better really, as it adds flexibility to the unit. So in summary, the Armiger Warglaive is a very fast, fairly durable anti-tank unit that's best at shredding tanks in close combat with that Reaper chain cleaver, but can do some reasonably decent shooting damage while it gets there. And against hordes it's not entirely useless because it has that sweep attack to hopefully off a bunch of enemy infantry models. So which households are best for armigers? Out of the Questor Imperialis households, House Terran is great, as re-rolling charges will give you more reliability about getting into the foe. House Mortan is a flat buff to close combat, giving you +1 to hit, which can be very nice with all of those melee attacks. And House Griffith adding +1 to the attacks characteristic is also very strong too. House Cadmus's reroll of 1s to wound is kind of flatly inferior to these other two on armigers, unfortunately. Hawkshroud's lower degrading profile is generally helpful on vehicles, but I find it tends to be better on the big knights because there's more chance of them being wounded but not killed. You might well just lose armigers outright. Into the Mechanicus houses, House Raven has limited benefit on armigers. They might well be advancing a fair bit, but because they have thermal spears, they can still shoot anyway even if they do advance, so only getting +1 to that hit roll on Raven is a bit meh really. House Tyrannus is pretty great on these guys. A 6-up Feel No Pain makes them more durable all round, and is a solid pick on any Imperial Knights unit. House Krast is probably my favourite for the Armiger Warglaives, as it will give them 4 rerolls to hit when they charge, are charged, or make a heroic intervention, so it's a far stronger buff than any of the other households' bonuses to their flat melee damage. Admittedly, this does drop off if you're having multi-round combats, but in Warhammer 40k, the vast majority of the important combats tend to be on the turn that someone charges. So I think that Krast is a very strong pick for Armiger Warglaives. And finally, House Volker's reroll of 1s when targeting the closest model is okay, but I think I'd rather buff the melee profile of this knight because the melee profile is more impressive than the shooting profile. The Knight Preceptor has some interesting synergy with the Armiger Warglaives. The Knight Preceptor has a Mentor special rule which allows reroll hit rolls of 1 for any friendly Armiger class units within 6 inches of this model. If you are thinking about taking absolutely loads of armigers, then it might well be surrounding a Preceptor with a whole bunch of these guys, and they'll have a far improved shooting output as they move in for the kill, and hopefully you can be in a position to get some of those rerolls of 1 off in close combat. I'm not sure I would necessarily take a Knight Preceptor myself, as they aren't some of the strongest knights compared with some of the other Questoris classes, and getting within that 6-inch aura can be a bit problematic when you only have limited models anyway. You're often going to need your knights to divide their forces and go after different enemy units, and you're not going to be as easily able to keep your units within that 6-inch aura without making some sacrifices on positioning. All that being said though, I could see a build where the Knight Preceptor backed up by a bunch of armigers, and it just improves all of their damage as they move in for the kill. You could further augment this strategy with the Helm Dominatus, which appears to be a relic made for the Knight Preceptor. Now this is Questor Mechanicus only, and essentially in the shooting or fight phase, you can nominate an enemy unit within 24 inches of the bearer, and all friendly Armiger class units gain +1 to hit against that unit for the remainder of that phase. So if you did have your Knight Preceptor clustered with a bunch of Armiger Warglaives around it, then you could really tell them to absolutely annihilate an enemy heavy that's nearby with all of their thermal spears. Hitting on 2-up will be very nice with them, particularly as they'll be re-rolling 1s as well. To my knowledge, you can also give other relics to Armiger models, provided they have the character keyword, which they can gain through the Knight Lance ability. For the most part though, I don't really see that it's being particularly valuable to give the Armigers relics. For the most part, you're best off just giving that to your Questoris or Dominus pattern knights, as they're the ones that will see the bigger benefit as they're bigger, more threatening models. In a pinch though, if you did happen to have 1 additional spare relic slot, then I could see, for example, for 1 command point, giving an Armiger the armour of Sainted Ion for a 2-up armour save could be particularly nice. But you would have to do this with your initial relic that you get, because you have an Imperial Knights Warlord, the heirlooms of the household and exalted court stratagems don't let you give relics to armigers. Speaking of stratagems, there are a few stratagems that apply to armigers. Firstly, we have pack hunters for 1 command point. This means that once you've charged with an armiger warglaive, then you can re-roll charges for other armiger warglaives that are within 12 inches to give them a higher chance of making that charge. I could see this being potentially useful if, say, you had 3 armigers about to go in for the charge, and some of them had slightly iffy ranges where they might not make it. This is a lot more niche than it sounds though, as it relies on you not having lost a lot of armigers getting in, so you only have 1 or 2 left, and also that you're actually having charges that you think that you might fail, so they're having to charge from quite a long way away. If it's, say, less than 5 inches or so, then I certainly wouldn't bother with this. You're likely to make the charge anyway, and not waste a CP doing so. So that does have potential use, but fairly niche. There's the full tilt stratagem, which I more often tend to use on gallants, but if you absolutely do have to get an armiger a long way across the battlefield, then you can use this to advance the armiger and then still be able to charge in the ensuing charge phase. It does cost 2 CP, so it's not the most efficient use of this stratagem compared with, say, a knight gallant, but it is an option. You can rotate ion shields with armigers, so if you desperately need a 4+ invulnerable save for a turn, then the armiger can get one for 1 command point. Again, more efficient on Questoris pattern knights, but it's good to be aware of the options. We have Bonded Oathsmen for 1 command point. Essentially you select a household Questoris class or Dominus class knight that has been charged this turn, and any armigers that are within 12 inches can immediately heroically intervene, and they can move 6 inches when doing so. So this could actually be very nice if you are using, say, the Knight Preceptor, someone charges that Knight Preceptor, and all of his little minions can suddenly dogpile the enemy. Again, it's fairly niche, as always with these stratagems for armigers it seems, but could be potentially very funny, that one. Machine Spirit Resurgent is always worth bearing in mind, to allow an armiger to fight on a full profile for 1 CP, even when badly damaged. This is efficient enough to be perfectly usable on armigers, as if they're up close they do have very destructive weapons, even if it isn't quite as nasty as, say, doing this on a Questoris pattern. So if I were to use armiger warglaives on the battlefield, then how would I field them? To start with, I would not take the melta gun, I would just stick with a standard heavy stubber. It already has a reasonable damage output, and I'd much prefer to take those save points and put them towards more knights for the most part. From there you could either buy in the armigers as part of some wacky build where you have lots of armigers around a Knight Preceptor, or you could just take 1 or 2 to fill out additional detachment slots alongside your main Imperial Knights army. If you're taking 2 or 3 Questoris pattern knights, then you could use it to fill out super heavy detachment slots, so you could split them into 2 detachments, say with 1 Questoris pattern knight and 2 armigers in each. And this could be useful for getting them 2 different households, which might be optimised for the types of knights you're fielding in each detachment. Say, for example, you could put a Crass detachment with a Crusader with the Headsman's Mark, and the Crass trait will massively buff up the armigers. On the battlefield, the armigers are good units to be able to exert pressure on the enemy. You want to be deploying them fairly close to the edge of your deployment zone, so they're ready to move and advance and get in the enemy's face. If you are running a lot of armigers, you can consider using concealed positions, which will give them a 2-up cover save turn 1, which is kind of useful if you want a bit more survivability. From there, I would just make as much haste as you can towards the enemy lines, which shouldn't be too hard with that enormous 14-inch movement. They need to be targeting whatever enemy heavy hitters that they can reach with that thermal spear, and then trying to get the charge as early as possible, whether it's chewing up some enemy screens, or hopefully getting in on a harder target to put that Reaper Chain Cleaver's main profile to work. Bear in mind that you can't fall back and shoot with Armiger Warglaives, so they're not quite as flexible as, say, their Knight Errant counterparts, who have a very similar loadout but just bigger and getting more of the Questoris pattern advantages. If you're running an army that's mainly Imperial Knights or is all Imperial Knights, then Armigers are particularly good units to send after an objective. You often won't want to be moving the Questoris or Dominus pattern Knights out of position just for claiming an objective, and these are the cheapest units that you have access to. So if there's any grunt work to be done, even though it's not ideal because they are a big threatening vehicle, it may be best to send an Armiger back to capture that objective rather than distract your bigger Knights from the important task of winning the battle. On a good day, Armigers can really punch above their weight, and one can sow a merry trail of discord through an enemy's flank, but in a bad day they can get eliminated and destroyed before they get to do anything of note on the battlefield. So my overall opinion on armigers for competitive play is that I'd almost always rather take a big Questoris pattern knight instead of the armiger if I have the option to. Now I think that the armigers versus the Questoris pattern knights, say for example the knight errant if we're comparing like for like, have fairly balanced profiles. The knight errant is worth a bit more than 2 armigers, but it has the same amount of wounds and toughness 8, so it's comparatively survivable and it's comparatively killy in close combat compared with those 2 armigers. But the main advantage that I find with the bigger knights is that they can be flexible and active in all turns of the battle. So you can charge a Questoris pattern knight in, stomp with it, and then fall back, shoot that massive gun, and then charge again the next turn. And sadly this is an option that the armigers just can't do. Also, any stratagems have a lot more of an effect on the big knights, as you're using them on a unit that's over double the value of the armigers, so it makes sense that they will get more value from that. So those are the main reasons that I prefer Questoris pattern knights to armigers for competitive play. That being said, armigers definitely are solid units. They're very capable of taking on their equivalents in multiple other armies, and they aren't significantly worse than the Questoris pattern knights point for point. I think they have more viability if you're trying to do an all knights army list, because there you just need a few extra units that can potentially sit on objectives in the backfield, or go after isolated objectives, or kill smaller enemy units as your big guns focus on the main threat of the enemy. So there is definitely room for them. I still really like them, and I've enjoyed fielding my own when I've had occasion to. Thanks for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. We'll be continuing with the knights tomorrow, where we'll be having a look at the relics and warlord traits that are available to our households. So feel free to subscribe or just join us back tomorrow if you'd like to see that. I should hopefully have my Space Marine Chaplain Dreadnought video up then as well, which I'm quite looking forward to recording. Thanks very much for listening, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.